The year is 1967, and deep within the humid, verdant jungles of Singapore, a secret war is being fought. It is not a war of bullets and bayonets, but a war of frequencies, codes, and whispers. Hidden beneath the canopy of Bukit Gombak and disguised behind the fences of Chai Keng, massive parabolic dishes and high-frequency antenna arrays turn slowly against the tropical sky. Inside the windowless concrete bunkers, air conditioners hum a monotonous drone, fighting a losing battle against the equatorial heat, while row upon row of tape recorders spin, capturing the invisible currents of the Cold War. These are the eyes and ears of the British Empire in the Far East. For decades, this sprawling electronic nervous system, linked directly to the Government Communications Headquarters, or GCHQ, in Cheltenham, has intercepted the military orders of Indonesian generals, the diplomatic cables of Beijing, and the covert movements of communist insurgents in the Malayan Peninsula. Singapore is not merely a trading port. It is the most sophisticated listening post in the Southern Hemisphere, a panopticon that allows London to see everything that moves in Southeast Asia. But as the sun sets over the Straits of Malacca, a terrifying realization is dawning on Lee Kuan Yew. The lights are about to go out. The crisis began not with an invasion, but with a budget report in London. The British economy was hemorrhaging, the pound was devaluing, and the Labour government under Prime Minister Harold Wilson faced a stark choice: save the economy or save the empire. They chose the economy. In January 1968, the announcement came down like a guillotine. The British military withdrawal east of Suez would be accelerated. They were leaving, and they were leaving early. For Lee Kuan Yew, this was not just an economic catastrophe. It was an existential security nightmare. He knew better than anyone that Singapore's survival depended on information. The island was a tiny, Chinese-majority dot surrounded by a sea of volatile Malay Muslim neighbors. Relations with Indonesia were still raw from the confrontasi, the undeclared war of bombings and sabotage that had ended only a few years prior. Relations with Malaysia were toxic following the separation. Singapore was a target-rich environment with zero strategic depth. Lee Kuan Yew sat in his office, looking at the maps of the British installations that dotted his island. He realized with a cold, sinking dread that the British were not just taking their soldiers and their ships, they were taking their brains. The sophisticated radar networks that scanned the horizon for incoming bombers, the signals intelligence units that cracked the codes of potential enemies, the vast libraries of dossiers on subversives, all of it belonged to Her Majesty's government. When the Union Jack came down for the last time, the technicians would pull the plugs, pack up the cryptographic machines, and shred the files. Singapore would be left blind and deaf. The island would be struck with a sudden, total sensory deprivation. If an Indonesian paratrooper unit boarded a plane in Jakarta, Singapore would not know until the parachutes opened over Orchard Road. If a communist cell in the jungle received an order to assassinate a minister, the interception would never happen. The panic in the cabinet room was palpable. The Singaporean armed forces were in their infancy, barely able to march in step, let alone operate complex electronic warfare suites. They had no satellites, no spy planes, and no indigenous intelligence infrastructure. They had relied entirely on the security umbrella of the British. Now that umbrella was folding, and the storm clouds were gathering. Lee Kuan Yew understood that sovereignty was an illusion without intelligence. You cannot govern what you cannot see. You cannot defend against what you cannot hear. The withdrawal threatened to turn Singapore into a helpless invalid, groping in the dark, waiting for the first blow to land. But as Lee Kuan Yew wrestled with the prospect of an intelligence blackout, another player was watching the British departure with a very different emotion: hunger. Across the Pacific, in the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallways of Langley, Virginia, the Central Intelligence Agency saw the British withdrawal not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity of a lifetime. The United States was deeply entrenched in the Vietnam War. The conflict was consuming American resources and attention, and intelligence on the movement of supplies and troops through Southeast Asia was worth more than gold. The CIA knew exactly what was inside those bunkers in Singapore. They knew that the British Y service stations in Singapore were some of the best-positioned assets in the world to monitor the communications of the People's Republic of China and North Vietnam. For the Americans, the logic was ruthlessly efficient. Why build new listening posts in volatile countries when they could simply step into the warm shoes of the departing British. The infrastructure was already there. The antennas were tuned. The bunkers were hardened. All they needed to do was secure the keys. The CIA viewed Singapore as a prime piece of real estate, a stationary aircraft carrier that doubled as a giant antenna. They assumed that Kuan, desperate and vulnerable, would be begging for American protection. They assumed he would hand over the keys to the bunkers in exchange for a security guarantee. They envisioned a seamless transition where the British officers walked out the front door and the American officers walked in the back, changing the flags but keeping the machines running. This, however, created a dangerous new dynamic. Kuan was terrified of being abandoned by the British, but he was equally terrified of being possessed by the Americans. He knew the history of the CIA. He knew they did not operate as guests. They operated as owners. If he allowed the CIA to take full control of the British intelligence infrastructure, Singapore would cease to be a non-aligned nation. It would become a de facto American forward operating base. The intelligence gathered by those machines would not flow to the Singaporean government to help them stop riots or detect neighbors. It would flow directly to Washington to fight a war in Vietnam that Kuan wanted no part of. Singapore would become a target for anti-American sentiment, for communist reprisals, and for the wrath of China. The battle for the bunkers was thus joined. It was a silent, three-way struggle. The British wanted to cut their costs and leave as quickly as possible, stripping the assets to prevent sensitive technology from falling into the wrong hands, even if those hands belonged to their former colony. The Americans wanted to inherit the empire's tools to expand their global surveillance network, and Kuan wanted to survive. He needed the capability of the machines, but he could not afford the political cost of the American operators. He needed the magic of the radar and the wiretaps, but he needed them to be Singaporean. The stakes could not have been higher. This was not a battle for territory in the traditional sense. It was a battle for the electromagnetic spectrum. It was a battle for the phantom limb of the empire. Inside those concrete rooms lay the capacity to know the future, to know when a coup was brewing, when a fleet was sailing, when a riot was organized. To lose that capacity was to accept death. To hand it over to a foreign power was to accept servitude. Kuan had to find a third way. He had to figure out how to keep the lights on without selling his soul to the electrician. As 1968 approached, the atmosphere in the listening stations became ghostly. British technicians began burning documents in oil drums behind the barracks. Classified equipment was crated up. The hum of the interceptors began to fade. In the silence, the CIA began to make its moves, sending envoys, making quiet offers, promising to pay for the maintenance of the facilities if they could retain operational control. They were circling like vultures over a dying beast, waiting to pick the bones of the British intelligence network. Kuan watched them. He knew he was outgunned. He knew he didn't have the engineers or the cryptographers to run these systems himself. But he also knew that he held the ultimate trump card, sovereignty. The bunkers were on his soil. The cables ran under his streets. And he was determined that when the British left, the secrets of Singapore would not leave with them, nor would they be outsourced to Washington. He prepared to bluff, to threaten, and to negotiate for the very nervous system of his nation, knowing that one wrong move would leave his country blind, deaf, and defenseless in a neighborhood of wolves. To understand the ferocity of the shadow war that erupted in 1968, one must first look past the political rhetoric and focus on the hardware. When the British Empire announced its retreat, they were not just packing up ceremonial uniforms and closing officers' clubs. They were threatening to unplug one of the most sophisticated, high-value intelligence machines on the face of the earth. The crown jewels of the British presence in Singapore were not gold or diamonds. They were vacuum tubes, copper wiring, parabolic dishes, and filing cabinets. These were the assets of the Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ, and the Special Branch, a sprawling infrastructure of surveillance that had been meticulously built over decades to ensure that London knew the secrets of the Orient before the locals did. To Kuan, these assets were the organs of state survival. To the CIA, they were the ultimate prize in the Cold War treasure hunt. The centerpiece of this electronic empire was the Chai Keng radio receiving station. Hidden away in the Serangoon district, surrounded by tall fences and guarded by Gurkhas, Chai Keng was a forest of steel. It was a farm of rhombic and log periodic antennas, immense geometric shapes of wire strung between towering masts that dominated the skyline. To the uneducated observer, they looked like abstract sculptures or perhaps oversized laundry lines. But to an intelligence officer, they were beautiful. These antennas were tuned to the ionosphere, designed to snatch high-frequency HF radio waves out of the air from thousands of miles away. In the era before global satellite surveillance was fully mature, HF radio was the lifeblood of military and diplomatic communication. Every time a North Vietnamese general radioed a supply convoy on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, every time a Chinese Communist Party official in Beijing sent a coded telex to a cell in Jakarta, and every time an Indonesian submarine surfaced to report its position, those signals bounced off the atmosphere and rippled through the skies of Southeast Asia. Chai Keng was the net designed to catch them. The station was a masterpiece of signal intelligence, or SIGINT. Inside the air-conditioned bunkers, hundreds of British operators sat in shifts wearing heavy headphones, their fingers hovering over typewriters and tape recorders. They were part of a global network called UKUSA, the secret treaty between the UK and the USA that divided the world into listening zones. Singapore was the ear of the network for the Far East. The intelligence gathered here was staggering in its volume and sensitivity. It provided the order of battle for the Chinese People's Liberation Army. It tracked the movements of the Soviet Pacific Fleet as they transited the South China Sea. It monitored the internal stability of Malaysia and Indonesia. This facility did not just produce data, it produced foresight. It allowed the British, and by extension their American allies, to predict coups, invasions, and insurgencies. For the CIA, the value of Chai Keng was incalculable. The United States was bogged down in Vietnam, fighting a war where the enemy was elusive and intelligence was often faulty. They were desperate for product, raw intercepts that could give them an edge. While the Americans had their own listening posts in the Philippines and Thailand, Singapore offered a unique geographic advantage. Situated at the tip of the Malay Peninsula, it sat perfectly at the crossroads of the equatorial airwaves. Atmospheric conditions near the equator often allowed for unique signal propagation, meaning Singapore could hear things that stations further north could not. Furthermore, the British had spent years tuning their equipment to the specific frequencies and eccentricities of the regional actors. They had the dictionaries of the local codes. To replicate Chai Keng from scratch would cost the CIA hundreds of millions of dollars and take years to build, years they did not have. To simply walk in and take over the British console was the dream scenario. But the crown jewels were not limited to the interception of foreign armies. There was a second, darker layer to the infrastructure that Kuan was even more obsessed with, the archives. Over the course of the colonial era, particularly during the brutal 12-year guerrilla war, known as the Malayan Emergency, the British Special Branch had compiled a massive, terrifyingly detailed library of human intelligence. These were not electronic signals. They were paper dossiers. Thousands upon thousands of files detailed the identities, habits, families, and weaknesses of every known communist sympathizer, trade union agitator, student radical, and secret society gangster in Singapore and Malaya. This registry was the institutional memory of the state's survival. It contained the organizational charts of the underground communist cells. It listed who had been turned, who was susceptible to blackmail, and who was a hardcore ideologue. It mapped the intricate web of front organizations, the sports clubs, the musical associations, the Chinese middle schools, that the communists used to recruit and mobilize the masses. For Kuan, who was engaged in a life-or-death struggle against the Barisan Socialis and the radical left, these files were more valuable than tanks or fighter jets. They were the map of the minefield he was walking through every day. If he knew who the enemy was, he could arrest them, detain them, or outmaneuver them. Without these files, he was fighting blindfolded. The danger of the British withdrawal was that, according to standard colonial retreat protocol, sensitive intelligence files were often destroyed to protect sources and methods. The British had burned files in India. They had burned files in Palestine. Kuan lived in terror of the incinerators. He feared that the British, in their haste to leave, would strike a match and reduce Singapore's history of subversion to ash, leaving the new government with no memory of who its enemies were. Alternatively, he feared they would pack the files into crates and ship them back to London, or worse, hand them over to the Americans as a parting gift. This is where the CIA's interest became predatory. The agency knew that while SIGINT, signals, won battles, HUMINT, human intelligence, won nations. If the CIA could get their hands on the Special Branch archives, they would effectively hold the keys to Singaporean politics. They would know where the skeletons were buried. They could identify potential assets to recruit within the Singaporean government. They could use the dossiers to blackmail politicians or to manipulate the outcome of internal power struggles. Possession of the archives would give the CIA the power to reshape Singapore's political landscape to suit American interests. They could purge those they deemed unreliable and prop up those they could control. To the CIA, these files represented the ultimate leverage. The strategic geography of the island itself was the final component of the prize. Singapore controls the Strait of Malacca, the narrow channel through which nearly half of the world's seaborne trade and a vast majority of its oil supply passes. It is one of the world's true choke points. In the context of the Cold War, keeping the strait open for the West and closed to Soviet expansion was a primary strategic imperative. The British naval base at Sembawang was the finest naval facility east of Suez, capable of dry docking massive aircraft carriers. The air bases at Tengah and Changi were perfectly positioned to project power into the South China Sea. The CIA looked at the map and saw a vacuum forming. If the British left and Lee Kuan Yew failed to fill the void, who would? The Soviets were expanding their navy. The Chinese were supporting insurgencies. The Americans were terrified that Singapore, without the British anchor, would drift into the communist orbit or become a chaotic, ungoverned space that would threaten the flow of oil. They did not trust the fledgling Singapore Armed Forces, which barely existed in 1968, to secure this vital real estate. They believed that only a superpower could hold the gate. And since the British were abdicating their duty, the Americans felt a moral and strategic obligation to step in. Thus, the infrastructure at stake was a triad: the electronic ears of Chai Keng that listened to the enemies abroad, the paper brains of the Special Branch Registry that remembered the enemies within, and the physical muscle of the naval and air bases that commanded the seas. It was a turnkey totalitarian starter kit. Whoever controlled these three elements possessed the power of a god over the region. They could hear every whisper, remember every sin, and choke off the trade of nations. For Lee Kuan Yew, the realization was stark. The British had built this machine to protect their empire. Now that the empire was gone, the machine was up for grabs. He knew that the CIA was already negotiating in the back rooms of London and Washington. He knew they were discussing asset transfers and joint operations. They treated the infrastructure as if it were a piece of furniture to be passed from one white hand to another, ignoring the fact that it sat in the living room of an Asian sovereign state. Lee realized that if he did not act, if he did not intervene in this transaction, Singapore would become a vassal state, a shell company for American intelligence. He would be prime minister in name only, while the real decisions were made by men reading telexes in a bunker he wasn't allowed to enter. The battle, therefore, was not just about keeping the lights on. It was a battle for cognitive sovereignty. Lee Kuan Yew had to seize the means of perception. He had to ensure that when the radar swept the horizon, it was a Singaporean eye interpreting the blip. He had to ensure that when a file was pulled on a subversive, it was a Singaporean hand holding the folder. The technological gap was immense. His people did not know how to run the machines. But he knew he could not let the Americans own them. He had to find a way to inherit the power without inheriting the master. The crown jewels were lying on the table, and the American eagle was swooping down to snatch them. Lee Kuan Yew had to be faster. While Lee Kuan Yew was frantically calculating the survival odds of his island in the cabinet rooms of City Hall, a very different conversation was taking place 6,000 miles away, in the hushed, oak-paneled private clubs of London and the sterile, fluorescent situation rooms of Washington, D.C. This was the quiet, confident dialogue of the Anglo-American alliance, the special relationship that had defined the post-war order. To the British and American intelligence establishments, the withdrawal from east of Suez was not a crisis of security. It was merely a logistical problem of asset management. They viewed Singapore not as a partner to be consulted, but as a piece of real estate to be transferred. The CIA was moving in like a vulture circling a dying empire, waiting for the British lion to finally loosen its grip on the prize so that the American eagle could swoop down and claim the carrion. The approach was made with the cold transactional logic of a corporate acquisition, bypassing the Singaporean government entirely in a display of imperial arrogance that treated the sovereignty of the island nation as a quaint administrative fiction. The foundation of this backroom deal was the Five Eyes Agreement. Established in the aftermath of World War II, this secret treaty bound the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand into the most exclusive intelligence club in history. It was a brotherhood of spies who shared everything: codes, intercepts, assets, and enemies. Within this closed loop, national borders dissolved. A British station was an American station, and vice versa. Singapore, despite being a Commonwealth member, was not eyes only. It was an outsider. It was a subject. In the minds of the men running MI6 and the CIA, the listening posts in Singapore did not belong to Singapore. They belonged to the Alliance. They were nodes in a global nervous system that protected the West. Therefore, the fate of these nodes was a matter to be decided between white men in London and Washington, not by an Asian prime minister in the tropics. The CIA's proposal to the British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, was brutally simple. They knew that the British Treasury was broke. They knew that the Labour government under Harold Wilson was desperate to slash the defence budget. The cost of maintaining the massive intercept stations at Chai Keng and the radar arrays across the island was a hemorrhage the British could no longer afford. The Americans, however, were flush with cash. The Vietnam War had opened the floodgates of congressional funding for intelligence. The CIA approached their British counterparts with a solution that seemed perfect on paper. Do not dismantle the stations. Do not burn the codes. Do not fire the staff. Simply hand the keys to us. The American offer was comprehensive. The CIA proposed to fully fund the operation of the Singapore stations. They would pay for the electricity, the maintenance of the delicate parabolic dishes, the salaries of the technicians, and the upgrades to the cryptographic computers. In exchange, the British would quietly step aside, and the CIA would assume operational command. To the outside world, perhaps the flag flying over the base would remain ambiguous, or perhaps it would be nominally transferred to Australian control to soften the optics, but the data, the raw, pulse-pounding intelligence flowing from the ether, would be piped directly to Langley, Virginia. The British would retain access as a courtesy of the Five Eyes, but the Americans would be the landlords. This maneuver was driven by a profound sense of American exceptionalism and a deep-seated technological arrogance. The CIA looked at the complexity of the equipment inside those bunkers, the high-frequency direction-finding arrays, the vacuum tube decoders, the magnetic tape libraries, and they concluded that the Singaporeans were simply too primitive to handle it. In the 1960s, the prevailing view in Western intelligence circles was deeply paternalistic. They believed that signal intelligence, SIGINT, was a white man's magic. It required advanced mathematics, physics, and a level of technical sophistication that they assumed a newly independent third-world nation could not possibly possess. They feared that if they handed the equipment over to Lee Kuan Yew's government, the locals would break it within a week. Worse, the Americans feared that the Singaporeans were compromised. The racial makeup of Singapore, majority ethnic Chinese, was a source of constant paranoia for the CIA. They looked at the faces of the Singaporean technicians and saw potential sympathizers with Beijing. They worried that blood calls to blood. In their racialized worldview, they could not conceive that a Chinese Singaporean could be loyal to an independent Singapore and hostile to Mao's China. They feared that if Lee Kuan Yew controlled the listening posts, the intelligence would be leaked to the communists, or that the security of the Five Eyes network would be shattered by a double agent. They saw Singapore as a leaky vessel, a place teeming with secret societies and communist cells. To trust such a nation with the crown jewels of Western intelligence seemed to the CIA like madness. Therefore, the strategy was total exclusion. The CIA wanted to create a black box on Singaporean soil. The facility would exist within Singapore physically, but legally and operationally, it would be a sovereign island of American power. The Singaporean government would be told only what they needed to know, which, in the CIA's estimation, was nothing. They would not be given the raw data. They would not be taught how the machines worked. They would not be allowed inside the secure perimeter. They would simply be the host, providing the land and the electricity, while the adults in the room conducted the serious business of the Cold War. The Americans assumed that Lee Kuan Yew would accept this arrangement. In fact, they assumed he would be grateful. After all, they reasoned, Singapore was terrified of being abandoned. The Americans were offering a security guarantee of sorts. By maintaining a presence, even a covert one, they were signaling to Indonesia and Malaysia that Singapore was still under the Western umbrella. They thought Lee Kuan Yew was desperate enough to accept any terms. They viewed him as a beggar who should be happy with crumbs. They did not understand that they were dealing with a man who would rather starve than eat from a bowl placed on the floor. The negotiations between London and Washington proceeded with a presumptuous speed. Draft agreements were drawn up. Technical teams from the National Security Agency, NSA, the CIA's partner in electronic surveillance, began to survey the sites, making plans for upgrades. They discussed the logistics of swapping out British personnel for American contractors. They debated how to disguise the American presence to avoid inflaming anti-war sentiment in the region. They discussed everything except the one variable that mattered, the consent of the landlord. To the Americans, the British withdrawal was a transaction of assets. They viewed the antennas at Chai Keng the same way they viewed a used car being sold by a friend. They were buying the car. The fact that it was parked in someone else's driveway was a minor detail. They failed to recognize that for Lee Kuan Yew, these bases were not just assets. They were symbols of national dignity. If a foreign power operated a secret base on his territory without his control, he was not a prime minister. He was a colonial governor. He was a puppet. The CIA's approach was not just a business deal. It was an insult to the very concept of Singaporean independence. The Americans also failed to appreciate the strategic hunger of Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew didn't just want protection, he wanted capability. He wanted to learn. He wanted his people to master the dark arts of electronic warfare so they would never again be dependent on the whims of a foreign power. The CIA's plan to keep Singapore blind and deaf while using their land to spy on their neighbors was the ultimate provocation. It meant that Singapore would bear the risk of being a target for Soviet or Chinese retaliation without gaining any of the benefits of the intelligence. It was a parasitic relationship. As the secret cables flew back and forth across the Atlantic, the CIA felt confident. They had the money. They had the technical expertise. They had the agreement of the British. They believed the deal was done. They were preparing to move in, to repaint the signs, and to continue the great game of espionage from the comfort of the Singaporean jungle. They were the vultures descending on the carcass, ready to feast, but they had forgotten to check if the carcass was actually dead. They were about to discover that the dying nation of Singapore was very much alive, and that its leader had no intention of letting his country become a silent parking lot for American spies. The vulture was about to meet the dragon. The silence that shrouded the backroom dealings between London and Washington was designed to be impenetrable, a wall of classification and diplomatic protocol meant to keep the subjects of the negotiation in the dark. But in Singapore, secrets have a way of sweating through the walls. Lee Kuan Yew, possessing a network of informants that permeated every level of the civil service and the military establishment, caught the scent of the betrayal before the ink was dry. It might have been a casual remark by a British officer over a gin and tonic at the Tanglin Club, or a discrepancy in a shipping manifest for electronic equipment addressed to the US Embassy instead of the British High Commission. However the intelligence arrived, the picture that formed in Lee's mind was clear and infuriating. The British were selling the nervous system of his country to the Americans, and they hadn't even bothered to ask for his permission. The realization triggered a cold, visceral fury in the Prime Minister. It was the fury of a man who had spent his entire adult life fighting to rid his country of colonial masters, only to see the old master handing the keys to a new one. Lee understood immediately what the CIA plan entailed. If the Americans took over the listening posts at Chai Keng and the radar stations at Bukit Gombak under the proposed terms, Singapore would cease to be a sovereign state in the eyes of the intelligence community. It would become a black site, a platform for American power where the Singaporean government had no jurisdiction, no oversight, and no access. The data harvested from the Singaporean sky would bypass the Singaporean government entirely, flowing directly to the Pentagon. Singapore would bear all the risks of hosting a prime Cold War target, the threat of Soviet sabotage, the wrath of Chinese propaganda, while receiving none of the security benefits. Lee Kuan Yew decided to intercept the deal. He did not send a polite diplomatic cable. He did not request a consultation. He summoned the representatives of the British and American intelligence communities to a meeting that would become legendary in the annals of Singaporean statecraft. The atmosphere in the room was not one of negotiation. It was one of confrontation. On one side of the table sat the British, looking sheepish and eager to wash their hands of the imperial burden. On the other sat the Americans, confident, well-funded, and expecting a quick capitulation. At the head of the table sat Kuan, a man with no army to speak of, but armed with a terrifying clarity of purpose. He began by dismantling the premise of their deal. He told them that he was aware of the Five Eyes arrangement, and while he respected their alliance, Singapore was not a colony of the United States, nor was it a dependency of the United Kingdom anymore. "This is sovereign territory," he declared. "You cannot transfer assets on my soil as if you are selling a used car." He articulated a doctrine of data sovereignty that was decades ahead of its time. He argued that if a machine sits on Singaporean land and draws electricity from the Singaporean grid to listen to the airwaves over Singaporean airspace, the product of that machine belongs by rights to Singapore. To allow a foreign power to operate a black box intelligence facility without supervision was to abdicate the fundamental duty of government. It was to admit that he was not the master of his own house. The Americans pushed back. They played the card of technical superiority. They argued, with a heavy dose of condescension, that the systems were too advanced for the locals. They claimed that the security of the Five Eyes network required absolute segregation. They hinted that without American money, the stations would rot, and Singapore would be left with nothing. They tried to frame the takeover as a favor, a benevolent act of protection. "We are doing this for your security," they implied. "You need us to watch the communists for you." This was the moment Kuan played his ace. He knew he couldn't physically stop the Americans from withholding the codes or the funding, but he could stop them from having the location. He looked the American station chief in the eye and delivered a threat that was breathtaking in its scorched earth logic. He told them that if they did not agree to his terms, if they insisted on total control and exclusion, he would not simply kick them out. He would dismantle the facilities entirely. He would send in the bulldozers. He would tear down the rhombic arrays at Chai Keng. He would rip the copper wiring out of the bunkers. He would turn the most valuable listening post in Southeast Asia into a housing estate or a golf course. "I would rather be blind and deaf," Lee famously implied, "than be a puppet." It was the ultimate bluff, but it was delivered with such conviction that the Americans froze. They looked at this man, this poison shrimp, and they realized he was crazy enough to do it. They knew Lee's history. They knew he was a man who had wept for his country, but had also ruthlessly purged his enemies. He was a man of absolute principle. If he felt Singapore's dignity was being trampled, he would burn the asset rather than let it be used against him. Then, Lee twisted the knife further. He dropped a subtle hint that sent a shiver down the spines of the CIA operatives. He suggested that if the Americans and British were unwilling to partner with Singapore on equal terms, there might be other partners who would be interested in the geography. He didn't need to name them. The Israelis were already in Singapore training the army. The Soviets were looking for a warm water port. The Indians were non-aligned. The mere suggestion that Kuan might open a bidding war for the electronic real estate of the Malacca Strait was a geopolitical nightmare for Washington. The thought of Soviet technicians sitting in Chai Keng, listening to the US 7th Fleet, was unacceptable. Lee had leveraged his geography against their paranoia. Having terrified them with the prospect of total loss, Kuan then pivoted to the solution. He offered them a way out, a compromise that would save their strategic interests while preserving his sovereignty. He laid out his demand. "The hardware stays. The ownership transfers to Singapore. We hold the keys to the bunkers." The proposal was radical. The Singaporean government would essentially nationalize the British intelligence infrastructure. The newly formed Singaporean Intelligence Service would become the landlords and the operators. But Lee was a realist. He knew his people didn't know how to run the machines, so he completed the deal. "You, the Americans, will stay. You will not be the owners. You will be the consultants. You will train my people. You will teach us how to decrypt the codes. You will teach us how to maintain the arrays. In exchange, we will share the data with you. We will give you the feed on Vietnam and China, but we will see it first. and we will filter what is relevant to our national interest. It was a demand for a dual-key system. It forced the Americans to treat Singapore not as a subordinate, but as a peer. It required the CIA to transfer knowledge, not just money. It was a massive gamble. The Americans could have walked away. They could have called his bluff, packed up their equipment and left Singapore blind. But Lee Kuan Yew had calculated the odds perfectly. He knew that the intelligence value of Chai Keng was too high for the CIA to abandon. The Vietnam War was raging. They needed those intercepts. They needed to hear the North Vietnamese Army communications. A shared listening post was better than no listening post, and a partnership with a prickly Lee Kuan Yew was better than a vacuum filled by communists. The tension in the room broke. The Americans blinked. They realized that the era of colonial dictation was over. They were dealing with a new breed of Asian leader, one who understood the technical details of radar arrays, as well as the nuances of diplomatic blackmail. They agreed to the framework. The British, relieved to be off the hook for the cost and the responsibility, eagerly signed off. The deal was struck. This intervention was the turning point in the history of Singapore's intelligence community. It was the moment the Security and Intelligence Division, SID, ceased to be a mere branch of the police and began its transformation into a world-class technological agency. By intercepting the deal, Lee Kuan Yew had secured the physical infrastructure of a superpower for free. He had acquired millions of dollars worth of antennas, bunkers, and computers simply by refusing to let them go. But more importantly, he had secured the dignity of the state. He ensured that when the electronic eyes of Singapore opened to scan the horizon, the brain processing the image was loyal to the flag of Singapore, not the stars and stripes. The conflict over the bunkers was a microcosm of Lee Kuan Yew's entire foreign policy. It was a refusal to be passive. It was a rejection of the idea that small nations must simply accept the scraps falling from the tables of the great powers. He showed that even a small nation, if it holds a strategic asset, whether it be a strait, a port, or an antenna, has leverage. And if that nation has a leader with the nerve to use that leverage, it can force an empire to negotiate. The Americans walked out of that meeting with a deal, but they also walked out with a lesson. In Singapore, there are no back doors. You knock on the front door, or you don't get in at all. The handshake that concluded the tense confrontation between Lee Kuan Yew and the intelligence chiefs of the Anglo-American alliance was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a vast, complex, and highly classified experiment. The deal struck in the shadows of 1968 was a masterpiece of diplomatic alchemy. Lee had transmuted a potential occupation into a partnership, but as the delegates left the room and the adrenaline faded, the practical reality of the agreement began to settle in. They had a framework, yes, but the mechanics of this dual-key system had to be built from scratch. There was no manual for how a tiny, newly independent island nation integrates its raw, untested intelligence officers with the seasoned veterans of the Central Intelligence Agency and MI6. What followed was a period of intense, quiet activity behind the barbed wire fences of Chai Keng and the concrete walls of the Ministry of Interior and Defense. It was the birth of a new organism, a hybrid intelligence apparatus that would serve two masters with very different agendas. The first phase of this resolution was the transfer of magic. The Americans, true to their word and driven by their desperate need for the data, began to deploy a different kind of asset to Singapore. These were not the trenchcoat spies of the movies, nor the clumsy bagmen of the 1961 bribery scandal. These were the technocrats of the ether, engineers from the National Security Agency, NSA, and signal specialists from the CIA's Office of Technical Service. They arrived in Singapore often under the guise of commercial contractors or technical consultants attached to the American embassy. Their mission was ostensibly to upgrade the aging British equipment, replacing vacuum tubes with transistors and installing the latest American encryption gear. But their real mission, forced upon them by Lee Kuan Yew's ultimatum, was instruction. For the young men of the Singaporean Security and Intelligence Division, SID, this was a baptism by fire. The SID in the late 1960s was a nascent organization, staffed largely by police officers who were experts in street-level investigation, but novices in the dark arts of electronic warfare. Suddenly they found themselves sitting in classrooms and bunkers next to men who had cracked Soviet codes and tracked U-boats in the Atlantic. The culture clash was immediate. The Americans were loud, confident, and steeped in the technological arrogance of a superpower. The Singaporeans were quiet, diligent, and possessed of a terrifying hunger to learn. Kuan had given his officers a strict mandate. Learn everything. Absorb every detail. Do not just operate the machine, understand the physics behind it. The Americans initially believed they could treat the Singaporeans as glorified janitors, men who would keep the air conditioning running and the coffee brewing while the US experts did the real work of analysis. They were wrong. They underestimated the educational rigor of the Singaporean system. The young officers Lee sent to the bunkers were the cream of the crop. Scholars, mathematicians, and engineers who had been tracked and groomed by the state. They absorbed the training with a speed that startled their instructors. Within months, the dynamic shifted. The Singaporeans were no longer just watching. They were tuning the arrays. They were identifying the unique fingerprints of Indonesian radio operators, and they were suggesting improvements to the interception protocols. The black box that the CIA had wanted to keep sealed was being pried open by the sheer intellectual force of their local partners. The operational heart of this resolution was the share and filter mechanism. This was the compromise that saved Singapore's sovereignty. In a purely American base, the raw feed from the antennas would go straight into a scrambler and be beamed to Washington, bypassing the host country entirely. Under the new agreement, the data flow was bifurcated. The raw intercepts, the cacophony of voices, Morse code, and telex signals snatched from the air, flowed into a central processing hub within the bunker. Here, Singaporean and American analysts sat side by side. The arrangement was a study in mutual benefit and mutual suspicion. The Americans were obsessed with the big picture, the strategic level. They wanted to know about the movement of North Vietnamese supply divisions on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They wanted to intercept the diplomatic cables between Beijing and Moscow to exploit the Sino-Soviet split. They wanted to track the Soviet submarines moving through the strait. Singapore, honoring the deal, allowed this data to flow freely to the CIA. Kuan had no love for the communists in Vietnam or China. Helping the Americans contain them served Singapore's long-term security interests. It was the price of admission to the Western security umbrella. However, Kuan had a domestic filter. While the Americans looked at the horizon, Lee looked at the ground. He realized that the same technology used to track a Soviet destroyer could be used to track a smuggler's boat carrying weapons to a local insurgent group. The same frequency analysis used to break a Chinese diplomatic code could be used to decrypt the communications of the Malayan Communist Party, MCP, hiding in the jungles of Pahang. This was the genius of the double game. The CIA was effectively subsidizing Singapore's internal security. The millions of dollars the US poured into maintaining the Chai Keng station meant that Singapore had a surveillance capability far beyond what its own GDP could justify. Kuan ruthlessly exploited this duality. He knew the CIA didn't care about a local trade union leader in Jurong or a student radical at the University of Singapore. To the Americans, these were insignificant specks. To Lee, they were existential threats. So he used the American-built infrastructure to build a domestic panopticon. The SID began to map the internal subversion networks of Singapore with a precision that was terrifying. They could intercept the radio messages of underground cells. They could trace the flow of funds from foreign donors to local opposition groups. The eyes and ears that the British left behind were turned inward. The CIA, focused on their global crusade against the Red Menace, largely turned a blind eye to how Lee used their toys in his own backyard. As long as the strategic product kept flowing to Langley, they didn't care if Lee used the same antenna to crush a local strike. This arrangement also solved the problem of data sovereignty. Under the agreement, copies of all relevant intercepts had to be provided to the Singaporean director of the SID. This meant that the CIA could not hide secrets about Singapore from Singapore. If the Americans intercepted a cable from the Indonesian government discussing a plot against Singapore, they were contractually and operationally obliged to share it. Kuan had created a failsafe. He knew he couldn't trust the Americans to be altruistic, so he embedded his own people in the workflow to ensure that nothing vital was held back. The Joint Intelligence Center became a place where information was the currency of trust. If the Americans held back, the Singaporeans would know, and the cooperation would freeze. It was a partnership held together by the mutual threat of a breakup. By the early 1970s, the shadow deal had matured into a highly efficient machine. The panic of the 1968 withdrawal was a distant memory. The lights had stayed on. In fact, they were burning brighter than ever. The listening posts were now state-of-the-art, upgraded with American computers that the British could never have afforded. The Singaporean officers, trained by the best in the world, were becoming experts in their own right, developing a distinct Singaporean school of intelligence that prioritized predictive analysis and total situational awareness. Crucially, this partnership remained invisible to the public. To the average Singaporean walking the streets, the massive antennas in the distance were just part of the landscape, perhaps related to telecommunications or air traffic control. To the neighboring countries, the extent of Singapore's capabilities remained a mystery. Indonesia and Malaysia knew Singapore was tough, but they didn't realize that their neighbor was reading their mail. The secrecy was paramount. If it became known that Singapore was effectively a node in the US global surveillance network, the political backlash from the non-aligned movement would have been severe. Kuan played the diplomat in public, shaking hands with Sukarno's successors and talking about ASEAN unity, while in private he read the transcripts of their confidential briefings. The resolution of the battle for the bunkers also had a profound psychological effect on the Singaporean leadership. It proved to them that they could stand toe-to-toe with superpowers and win. They had not been swallowed up, they had not been colonized. They had negotiated a business deal where they provided the location and the labor, and the Americans provided the capital and the IP. It was the ultimate model of the Singapore Inca's approach to statecraft applied to national security. As the years went on, the balance of power within the bunkers began to shift imperceptibly. In the beginning, the Americans were the teachers and the Singaporeans the students. But as the SID grew in competence and confidence, they began to innovate. They began to develop their own encryption methods, their own hardware modifications. They started to ask the Americans fewer questions and offer more answers. The dependency was fading. Kuan Yew's goal of self-sufficiency was being realized one circuit board at a time. He had successfully rented out a room in his house to a rich tenant, used the rent money to fix the roof, learned the tenant's trade, and was now preparing to eventually become the landlord in full. The shadow deal was a victory of pragmatism over ideology. Kuan Yew did not like the Americans' arrogance, and he certainly didn't trust them after the bribery attempts of the past. But he needed them, and the Americans, for all their bluster, needed him. They were stuck with each other in the foxhole of Southeast Asia. The compromise they forged in the heat of 1968 ensured that when the Vietnam War ended and the Americans eventually retreated, Singapore would not be left empty-handed. They would be left with the infrastructure, the know-how, and the files. They would emerge from the Cold War not as a casualty, but as one of the most intelligence-rich nations on the planet. The battle for the bunkers was over, and Singapore had won the most important prize of all, the ability to see the world as it truly is, without borrowing someone else's glasses. The silent sentinels in the jungle kept turning, listening to the secrets of the world. But now the hands on the controls were undeniably permanently Singaporean. By the mid-1970s, the hum of the air conditioners in the bunkers of Chai Keng had not changed, but the men standing in the blue glow of the monitors had. The American technicians, once the undisputed high priests of the electronic temple, began to notice a subtle but profound shift in the dynamic of the room. In the early days of the partnership, the Singaporean officers were silent observers, meticulously taking notes, asking for clarification, and treating the CIA manuals like sacred texts. But as the decade wore on, the questions stopped being about how and started being about why. The Singaporeans stopped asking for help to fix the machines. They started fixing them before the Americans even realized they were broken, and then they started modifying them. This was the phase of technological appropriation. Kuan Yew had instilled a culture of aggressive learning within the Security and Intelligence Division, SID, and the Ministry of Defense. He did not want a generation of operators who could simply push buttons. He wanted a generation of engineers who could rebuild the console from scratch. The Singaporean recruits, often returning with double first-class degrees in engineering and mathematics from British and American universities, looked at the aging British legacy equipment and the American upgrades and saw inefficiencies. They began to tinker. They rewired the circuit boards to filter out the specific static of the tropical atmosphere, something the American manuals hadn't accounted for. They wrote new code to patch the gaps in the encryption software. The Americans watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and unease. They had come to train a local force to hold the line, but they were inadvertently creating a competitor. The black boxes, the proprietary encryption devices the CIA provided to its allies, were usually sealed units, designed to be tamper-proof. The unspoken rule of US intelligence sharing is, use the box, don't open it. Singapore opened the box. They reverse-engineered the logic. They needed to know that there were no back doors left for their friends in Washington. This marked the psychological pivot from dependency to mastery. The student was not just graduating. The student was beginning to rewrite the syllabus. But for Lee Kuan Yew, competence was not enough. The shadow of the British withdrawal still loomed large in his psyche. He had seen how quickly a superpower could pack up and leave, taking their technology with them. He lived in perpetual fear that the winds of politics in Washington would shift. Perhaps a new president would turn isolationist, or a scandal would force the CIA to cut ties. If the Americans left, Singapore could not afford to go blind again. This paranoia birthed a new national imperative: autonomy. Singapore needed to build its own military-industrial complex, tailored to its specific needs as a small island state. This was the genesis of the Defense Science and Technology Agency, or DSTA, and the DSO National Laboratories. These organizations were established with a singular, classified mission: to ensure that the Singapore Armed Forces, SAF, possessed a technological edge that no money could buy on the open market. Lee Kuan Yew poured a disproportionate amount of the national budget into these institutions. While other developing nations were buying second-hand tanks and rifles, Singapore was investing in algorithms and sensors. The secret army of scientists and engineers grew in the shadows, tasked with developing indigenous electronic warfare suites, unmanned aerial vehicles, and surveillance systems. The philosophy was simple. If you buy a radar from the French or the Americans, they know exactly what it can do, and more importantly, they know how to jam it. If you build your own radar, or if you modify a foreign radar until it is unrecognizable, the enemy is blind. Singapore began to practice a doctrine of hybridization. They would buy an American airframe, put an Israeli sensor on it, and wire it together with Singaporean code. The result was a Frankenstein monster of high technology that threw off the calculations of any potential adversary. By the 1980s, the Singaporean intelligence infrastructure was no longer a collection of British leftovers. It was a unique, bespoke beast. As the Cold War ended, and the world pivoted from analog radio waves to digital fiber optics, Singapore's geography once again became its greatest asset. In the 19th century, Singapore was the coaling station for the British Navy. In the 20th century, it was the listening post for HF radio. In the 21st century, it became the hub of the Internet. Look at a map of the world's undersea cables, the glass veins that carry the lifeblood of the global economy. They converge on Singapore like the spokes of a wheel. The data traffic between Europe and Asia, between the Middle East and the Pacific, physically passes through the landing stations on the shores of the island. The legacy of the battle for the bunkers evolved into the battle for the bandwidth. The skills that the SID honed in the radio bunkers, pattern recognition, code breaking, traffic analysis, were perfectly transferable to the cyber domain. The government realized early on that information dominance was the only way a small state could project power. They didn't need a blue water navy to patrol the world. They just needed to sit on the cables. Singapore transformed itself into a global node of data. This was the panopticon, realized not just in a prison, but on a planetary scale. This digital evolution culminated in the concept of the smart nation, but beneath the glossy marketing of convenient apps and efficient public transport lies a hard kernel of national security. The systems developed to monitor external threats were turned inward to create a total defense architecture. One of the most famous and secretive manifestations of this is the RAS system, Risk Assessment and Horizon Scanning. Developed by Singapore's own engineers, RAS is a predictive intelligence tool that ingests massive amounts of data, from news reports to financial transactions to social media sentiment, to spot black swans before they appear. It is the digital grandchild of the British dossiers. Instead of paper files in a cabinet, it is AI-driven analysis. It is designed to answer Lee Kuan Yew's eternal question: what is coming to kill us? The Americans, who had once looked down on the Singaporean technicians, now came to study them. By the 2000s, the flow of expertise had become bidirectional. US officials marveled at how Singapore had integrated its military, intelligence, and civilian data into a seamless whole, something the sprawling, bureaucratic American system struggled to do. The CIA and the NSA maintained their close ties, but the relationship had fundamentally changed. It was no longer a relationship of patronage, it was a relationship of peerage. Singapore had become a Tier 1 partner in all but name. When the US wanted to understand the cyber threats emerging from China or the digital networks of terror groups in Southeast Asia, they didn't just tell Singapore what to do, they asked Singapore what they saw. The bunkers of the 1960s have largely been replaced or augmented by nondescript server farms and cybersecurity centers, but the spirit remains the same. The crown jewels that Lee Kuan Yew fought for were not the antennas themselves. Those rusted and were dismantled. The true jewels were the capability to build the antennas. By forcing the Americans to train his people, Lee Kuan Yew planted the seeds of a technological meritocracy. He ensured that the intelligence of the state resided in the brains of its citizens, not in the hardware on the desks. Today, Singapore is recognized as a global cyberpower. It punches well above its weight in the digital domain. It hosts the Interpol Global Complex for Innovation. It is a fortress of firewalls and encryption. This reality was not inevitable. It was engineered. If Lee Kuan Yew had accepted the CIA's offer in 1968, if he had allowed the Americans to turn Singapore into a black box, the indigenous expertise would never have flourished. Singapore would be hosting American NSA bases today, but it would not be a cyber power. It would be a landlord collecting rent while the tenants owned the building. Instead, the legacy is one of absolute control. The Singaporean government has achieved the ultimate dream of the intelligence officer: total situational awareness. They have successfully synthesized the British heritage of meticulous documentation, the American heritage of high-tech surveillance, and the Singaporean ethos of paranoid efficiency. The result is a state that sees everything. The panopticon is complete. It is a system where the government knows when a bus is late, when a drain is about to overflow, and when a hostile state actor is probing its firewalls. This technological sovereignty is the final vindication of the poison shrimp strategy. A shrimp is small and soft, but a cyber shrimp, or perhaps now a smart porcupine, is a different creature entirely. It is small, yes, but it is covered in sensors. It knows you are coming before you step into the water. It can sting you in the digital realm, disrupting your networks and exposing your secrets without ever firing a shot. The journey from the sweating, tape-spinning bunkers of the Vietnam War era to the silent, air-gapped server rooms of the 21st century is the story of a nation that refused to be a passive victim of technology. They seized the tools of the empire and sharpened them. They took the inheritance of the British, leveraged the ambition of the Americans, and built a fortress that is invisible to the naked eye but impenetrable to the enemy. Lee Kuan Yew's fear of going blind led him to build a nation that sees further than anyone else in the region. The lights never went out, they just turned into lasers. As the sun sets over the Bukit Timah hill, casting long shadows over the dense green canopy that still hides the secrets of the state, we are left to contemplate the sheer magnitude of the geopolitical high-wire act performed by Lee Kuan Yew. History is littered with the corpses of small nations that were crushed between the gears of colliding empires. When the British Empire collapsed and retreated, leaving a vacuum in the most strategic waterway on Earth, Singapore should have been one of those casualties. It should have been blinded by the loss of intelligence or swallowed whole by the overwhelming ambition of the American CIA. That neither of these things happened is not a matter of luck. It is a testament to a specific brand of cold, unsentimental genius, a leadership that understood that in the game of nations, the only currency that matters is leverage. The battle for the bunkers was, in retrospect, the definitive moment of Singapore's maturation. Lee Kuan Yew took a scenario that looked like a death sentence, the withdrawal of the eyes and ears that protected the island, and inverted it. He performed a masterful judo throw on history. He used the momentum of the departing British and the hunger of the arriving Americans to secure a future that neither of them intended to give him. He did not beg the British to stay. He made them pay to leave their equipment. He did not beg the Americans for protection. He made them pay for the privilege of using his geography. This was the grand larceny of the Cold War, committed in broad daylight. Lee Kuan Yew effectively nationalized the intelligence infrastructure of a superpower. He acquired millions of dollars in hardware, decades of institutional knowledge, and the cutting-edge training of the NSA, all for the price of saying yes, but he understood that the CIA needed the data more than he needed their money. By holding the dual key, by insisting on a partnership rather than a tenancy, he ensured that Singapore's security apparatus was built on the dime of the US taxpayer, but operated by the sons of Singapore. He transformed a crisis of abandonment into an opportunity for acceleration. The Americans thought they were buying a listening post. Lee Kuan Yew knew they were building him a university of espionage. The philosophical victory here was the preservation of the gatekeeper status. Throughout history, the ruler of Singapore has been the gatekeeper of the East, but for 150 years, that gatekeeper was a white man in a pith helmet. Lee Kuan Yew ensured that the keys were returned to Asian hands. He avoided the trap of becoming a client state, a puppet regime that exists solely to serve the strategic interests of a distant master. By forcing the CIA to share, to filter, and to respect his sovereignty, he carved out a space where Singapore could be pro-American without being anti-Asian. He maintained the delicate balance that allowed him to look Washington in the eye while still shaking hands with Beijing. Today, if you were to trek into the restricted zones of the Singaporean jungle, or stand outside the nondescript complexes of the Ministry of Defense, you would see the legacy of this transition. The massive parabolic dishes may have evolved into sleek phased array radars and fiber optic hubs, but the lineage is unbroken. These silent sentinels are still turning, still listening to the whispers of the world. They catch the electronic pulse of the Strait, the chatter of the South China Sea, and the data streams of the global economy. But the difference, the fundamental, existential difference, is the mind that processes the signal. The operators sitting in the cool blue light of the bunkers today are not colonial officers looking for threats to the crown, nor are they CIA agents looking for threats to the White House. They are Singaporeans looking for threats to their home. They are the guardians of the little red dot. Lee Kuan Yew's final victory was not just keeping the lights on, it was ensuring that when the switch was flipped, the power flowed to his people. He taught a small nation that it didn't have to be a pawn on the chessboard. If it was smart enough, sharp enough, and brave enough, it could be the player. The British built the machine, the Americans upgraded it, but Lee Kuan Yew hacked it. And in doing so, he ensured that Singapore would never again be blind, deaf, or silent in a dangerous world. The gate is secure, the watchmen are home, and the eyes of the Lion City are wide open.